Your local palace of entertainment. The flicks, the pictures, the flea pit. Whatever you knew it as, it was part of everyday life. For 40 years, the cinema was a major source of entertainment in Britain. The heyday of cinema was during the 1940s. In 1946 alone, there were 1,635 million attendances. It was an institution which seemed unchallengeable until the advent of television. Now, sadly, our cinemas are going out of business. In this age of screens 1 to 5 and £2.50 for one film, it was a pleasure to join Clyde Jevons of the British Film Institute in a traditional cinema. You can't beat the magic of walking through that curtain into the darkened auditorium with the flickering silver light and the prospect of an evening's entertainment before you. The news, the cartoon, trailers, the B-film, and the feature. But there was another element of the evening that we mustn't forget, and which Clyde has collected. The cinema advert. And a fascinating collection it is, too. I had no idea just how far back they go. This one was filmed at the turn of the century for Vinolia soap. It had to be shot outside the factory gates to get enough light. And the camera doesn't move, so the people do. It's one of the oldest in the collection. It may look simple now, but it was an innovation in its day.
They began, in the very early days, elaborately long. And some of the very early, what we call them advertising films, they're more like documentaries. They were elaborate descriptions of Le Cabre's factory, for example, or Peak-Freen biscuit factory. And looking back with hindsight, they're quite important films because they do show you a great deal of what was going on. And it's only when you reach the 40s, World War II, when film stock becomes very expensive and limited, that there is a drastic reduction in the length of the commercials.
Trying to make their impact in less time and less footage.
Well, that's what arose. The filmmaker had to learn to do that because he simply couldn't use as much film stock as he used to.
The Wills Woodbine commercial, I mean, I think you couldn't really call a documentary or a soft sell. I mean, it's a full-scale pantomime.
It was a pretty appalling parody of kind of the musical comedy films that were made at the time. But that, again, that has very high production value. It was made by the Alexander Korda studio, which made very important feature films.
Nay, that's too bad. And you never saw her since?
One thing to note in it, of course, it had a star, Edward Chapman, the well-known character actor of the time. It's one of the rare occasions when somebody is actually credited as being in a commercial.
A Turkish sheik arrived and proposed marriage to the whole chorus.
What? All of them at once?
Girls seemed to think he was Douglas Fairbanks and Rudolph Valentino, all rolled into one.
But the girls are finding out it's no great shakes in the harem.
Not many left. Stingy old beast. He gives us fewer and fewer each week. They're my only consolation. I don't mind telling you I'm bored.
I come to the conclusion my wife's smoked too much. Not seemly my wife smoke the WD and HO Wills cigarette.
Our heroes have reached Istanbul.
I'm right weary. I got flat feet, you know. Come on, let's sit down for a minute.
It's no good, I'll never find her.
Hey.
That tune.
That's right. Hey, up you get. Go on.
Betty!
Blimey!
What happens in my wife's bedroom?
The classic curly cut advert for tobacco, which I'm sure wouldn't be allowed today. It's quite outrageous in its use of the medical profession, isn't it?
I will not have that noise in my house.
What is the matter with you? You're like a bear with a sore head lately.
Oh, and who wouldn't be? Who wouldn't be? First it's the barrel organ outside, then it's the kid underneath, and now it's that gramophone. Everybody tries to annoy me.
Poor thing. And what about me? Shouldn't I be annoyed?
And what have you to be annoyed about?
Oh, nothing. Only if I suggest that we go out anywhere, you just can't be bothered. You mope and sit around and expect everybody else to be as miserable as you are.
Stop, stop, stop. I will not have arguments. They irritate me.
And you irritate me. I'm going straight home to my mother and serve you right.
And serve her right, you mean?
And if I were you, I should go and see a doctor. Perhaps he can cheer you up.
A doctor? That's not a bad idea.
Your prescription. To be taken as often as possible between meals.
Ah, bless the child.
Oh, your medicine certainly has done you good, even though you've only been taking it for 3 weeks.
Yes, and you know it's the best medicine I've ever taken.
Certainly smells nice.
And it tastes nice. I say, my darling, put on the gramophone.
Well, it appears appalling now by modern standards of regulations of what's acceptable and what with government health warnings and so on. I mean, actually having a doctor advise somebody to smoke for their nerves. But I think I recall this myself when I was young, that if one had nerves, doctors would advise smoking. I think I can remember that.
Well, in all forms of advertising at that time, claims could be made, which I think people wouldn't allow today.
Yes, I think it's only with the coming of television that more stringent standards have been imposed, simply because things are reaching a much wider public in a more influential way.
There's that sort of quasi-scientific approach to the advertising and the wild fantasy of wills. Also in two more, there's a much more modern sort of approach to the selling of the product, isn't there?
It is very modern and sort of rather laid back. It's in that rather nice sort of English realist style of a middle-class domestic setting, and not overacted at all, and rather intriguing in its social setting and the location shots. Particularly intrigued by this guy selling cigarettes on the beach. I don't think I ever remember that happening. I wonder if that really happened. But it's also very modern, this comparison between the kind of the silly family who can never get it right and the good family who've got it absolutely together to the extent they can afford a £5 holiday.
Improve their lifestyles enormously.
Yes, I mean, they're not going to live to see 40, but the way they're smoking in the film, but, they're having a good time. This was the peak time, I think, for the use of film and advertising in the cinema, dressing them up as entertainment films. It was the kind of heyday, the advertising film. And Ford, in particular, had virtually a whole film industry of its own going. It made numerous short, medium-length, quite long magazine-style films full of matter not necessarily related to the Ford company, just to keep the audience entertained, and every so often there would be a mention of a Ford product or something.
The road, the sun's in the sky, a heaven of blue, the world passes by. You feel so happy when you're sweeping along. A leafy byway, singing a song to the rhythm of the road.
And again, the production values were particularly high on this in the sense that the song and the orchestra were specially commissioned for the film. They actually set up a King Palmer's Shadow V8 Orchestra, I think it was called, for the purposes of this particular film, and employed Gordon Little, who was a sort of popular band singer, to sing the song. And the song itself was launched at the Ford Motor Show of that year in 1936, at the Albert Hall, I think. So it was quite a big number. And it's a pure entertainment in the sense that it's inviting the audience to sing along, which was a very popular thing to do in cinema then.
The sun's in the sky, a heaven aflow, the world dashes by. You feel so happy when you're sweeping along. A leafy byway, singing a song for the rhythm of the fall. You'll never be late if it's a V8 when you're speeding along to the rhythm of the fall.
The old Trojan commercial is much simpler, isn't it?
Well, it's more prosaic. The approach at that stage, it's about the mid-20s when I think that car was manufactured. And although already the commercials were giving quite a complex narrative approach, more or less subtle, with the payoff either some part way through at the end of the film, this is much more a direct approach to selling the car. But even then, it has some subtleties of its own. The economics at the beginning, comparing your foot,
proving
wearing out of your footwear with
actually cheaper than a pair of boots.
Exactly,
Yes.
or 4 shilling socks. So it still has a soft approach as well. Actually demonstrating the thing itself is very much of the time. There was the advertising very much harped on the product itself and how it worked and how well made it was, and demonstrating it on film like that was very much the approach of that time. It was a very extraordinary motor car, of course.
Yes.
I believe it was quite popular. I think it was an attempt at a sort of British Model T, a popular car for the lower middle classes or something of that nature.
It does look quite impressive on the film, actually.
Well, you still do some pretty weird things. Yes. I can't think of many cars today that could do that.
Humour features in a lot of commercials nowadays, and obviously in some of these old ones as well. When did the advertisers reckon that they realised that was a good selling point?
Well, right at the beginning, really. A couple of examples we've got, and are showing the early Dewar's whiskey commercials from the late 1890s, shot, I believe, by Edison in the United States. One of those is quite a humorous vignette of pictures coming to life and showing the Scotsman's glass of whiskey before Queen Victoria pops down in portrait form and joins the fray. I mean, that is meant to be humorous, obviously. Yes. And humour has often been the most popular and most successful form of advertising. I think a recent survey demonstrated that that's still true, that ads like the Joan Collins Cinzano and Heineken and the John Cleese commercials are the most successful in terms of market research. And so humour has always been a very strong vein running right through all the commercials.
The elopement in France is terrific. I mean, you could put that out today, couldn't you?
Oh, absolutely, yes. Perfect comic vignette. Very much in a modern style. And made by a man called Richard Massingham, who made many of the Ministry of Information shorts, instructional shorts during World War II, which were themselves made intentionally humorously. Yes. Massingham was a very eccentric sort of filmmaker and with a weird sense of humour, and appeared often in his own films. So those kind of filling up, don't put too much water in the bath, how to make a cup of tea, those kind of things. So, for him, making commercials like this was a natural offshoot of that kind of filmmaking.
Don't you worry, Marie. Tout sera laissé mais vos jupons le plus vite possible. C'est ça, mon petit. Et toi, Georges, pourquoi rester planté de cette façon? Mais capitaine, nous n'avons pas besoin. C'est ce que je te dis. Allez, hop. Voyons, mon petit, on ne pleure pas le jour de ses noces. À la bonne heure, un sourire. Le bout.
Step on it, Marie. You'll never make it. He's coming.
I can't help it, Joe. I've got to boil all these things.
Marie!
Marie.
Oui, Papa, dear.
How many times I tell you it is not necessary to boil the wash, but rinse so you can soak him clean in 12 minutes, and no hard rubbing. See, I have brought you a wedding present. I hurried all the way here on my push bicyclette. I could not think of letting my little cabbage start off on our mariage without it.
Oh, Papa, darling.
was also capable of lyrical approach as well. He was very adaptable, and commercial he made just after the war, An Englishman's Home, which is quite very lyrical indeed, and quite clearly an attempt to re-establish true English values after the conflict. Let's get back to good middle-class living again.
Home again, and free. Free to get out of these things and into something comfortable. Free to enjoy this. How peaceful it all is. And comforting to look at the old familiar things. So simple, and yet so important.
With our cottage and our Staffordshire china, the simple things of life. And but that is a very soft, subtle approach, which again would stand up now, I think, as a kind of a nostalgia. You could use actually the period. It's very
in fact, Ovaltine
trendy thing to do now.
Done
exactly.
that.
Yeah, of course, that kind of lifestyle was very rapidly swept away with the coming in of socialist government and so on. And within a decade, I doubt if many people were actually living like that. Although at the time that would have been the assumption would have been that that is what you aspired to. That very cozy, gentle lifestyle. Twin beds and a cup of Horlicks instead of the other. You know? Another point to note is, in both the Swan film and An Englishman's Home, the use of devices like children and animals, very obviously so in Swan Pens, the big doughy-eyed close-up of the little girl and baby talk. Less obviously so in Englishman's Home, which is camera simply cuts to the kitten and the dog romping on the carpet. But these devices, again, start right at the beginning of commercials. The filmmakers soon cottoned on to things that make the audience go, ah.
The commercials obviously are interesting for us now to look at because of the picture of life that they give. Are any commercials actually worth preserving for artistic reasons?
Very much so. Particularly, I think, in this country, which has for some reason, an extremely strong traditional link between the legitimate filmmaker and the commercial. And the commercial is certainly not something to be thrown away and snubbed simply because it's advertising something. And the George Powell series of commercials for Horlicks, which were, again, quite elaborate puppet animation. George Powell was a very fine animator at the start of his career. Made a whole series of quite high-budget Technicolor animation films advertising Horlicks. But they were, again, to go back to a point we made earlier, they're entertainment films, of course. It is cartoon length. It's the length you would expect a cartoon to be, whether it was Mickey Mouse or George Powell's Horlicks. And made to a very high standard and to a very high budget.
Take him away.
Unheard of.
But a cure has been found for the airman's lethargy. And you've guessed it, Horlicks.
Largely through the GPO film unit, which grew up in the 30s, which accommodated all the experimental documentary filmmakers like Humphrey Jennings and Cavalcanti and Len Lye and people like that, did extraordinary experimental work through commercials. So, for example, Rainbow Dance, which is probably Len Lye's supreme piece of animation filmmaking, It's just advertising the post office savings bank. That's the payoff. But it's a remarkable experimental animation film in its own right, and often quoted in people's 10 best lists as being a work of genius.
Savings bank puts a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for you.
The next phase, I suppose, of the commercial was the coming of television, wasn't it? Now, has that changed the nature of these short commercials or not?
Not a lot. You see, the film commercial, the cinema commercial, was already reducing to something approaching a television length. I think the most popular ones were about a minute or 2 minutes in the cinema. And the first television commercials, although they varied greatly in length, tend to be slightly longer than they are now. And there was a crossover as well. You could use, they were made on film, and so they could be shown on television or in the cinema, and indeed the first ones were, including what is allegedly the very first television commercial for Gibbs SR toothpaste.
It's tingling fresh. It's fresh as ice. It's Gibbs SR toothpaste, the tingling fresh toothpaste that does your gums good too. The tingle you get when you brush with SR is much more than a nice taste. It's a tingle of health. It tells you something very important, that you're doing your gums good and toughening them to resist infection. And as this chart shows, gum infection is the cause of more tooth losses than decay itself. The tingle in SR comes from sodium ricinoleate, a substance which both dental research and years of use in dental practice have shown to be good for the gums. So, to keep your teeth white as snow, your gums really healthy, and your breath really fresh, see your dentist regularly and brush with SR, the tingling fresh toothpaste for teeth and gums. Gibbs SR.
Its technique is not much different from many commercials today, 30 years later. It's still that kind of a spurious bit with the graph, you know, proving something by a graph, and the copy that's written for the product is very similar to the things you hear today.
What happens to your collection most of the time? Is it accessible?
It is, theoretically, the whole collection is or should be accessible. There's obviously no point in preserving masses and masses of films and television programs if they cannot both be enjoyed again and studied in the future. It is, however, a problem of priority and funding. We have a difficult enough time simply preserving neglected films and television programs. But progressively, we try to make duplicate copies of everything so that they can at least be studied by serious researchers and students. And also, we put back on the screen. But we can do this in a variety of ways. We're doing it today via a television program. And we also try and put on programs of particularly our rarer material, and the advertising collection is a good example, in, as it were, our own cinemas like the National Film Theatre and regional film theatres and venues of that nature.
And in adverts, the magic always works. Daddy gets his new Swan pen and becomes a successful novelist. Our smoking friend realizes that by smoking a new brand, he can have a holiday next year, and he's gained a pal. And of course, in your new Trojan, you can avoid untimely death at level crossings. Meanwhile, back at the harem,
I certainly take my hat off to that old Turk. He's taught you girls a thing or two. I only hope Mrs. will come to like it.
Wednesdays, then began the fun in sinking low. Take matches and your woodbines and then walking go. Down in the valley, under the trees, where you princess and many woodbines and the trees. Early in the
At the same time next week, A Sense of the Past looks back to life in Britain's industrial communities in the north.